Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to Naijha Speaks. My name is Naijha Wright Brown, co-owner of the Land of Kush Vegan Soul Bistro in Baltimore, Maryland. I have my husband with me today, Gregory Brown, co-hosting, so you're really in for a treat. In celebration of our 10-year anniversary, we've invited a very special guest who had the pleasure of connecting with us back in September of last year. This individual is a journalist who took it upon Isma'il Kushkush. How are we doing today, Isma'il? I'm sorry about that. How are you doing today?
Good, great. Thank you.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, Isma'il, your journalism, your background. How'd you get into this?
Sure. I am of Sudanese background. My father was a graduate student here in the 70s from Sudan. Initially, journalism was not the original plan. I wanted to be a historian. I wanted to, become a history professor. And 2007, I went to Sudan to reconnect with family. I hadn't been in the country almost 20 years, and I wanted to do some journalism and just reconnect with, rediscover my roots, visit the ancestral village that I'd never been to. What was supposed to be 4 months ended up being 8 years, and me getting into journalism, making that a permanent career choice. So I try to bring to my journalism this passion for history and context, and I'd always been critical of how African affairs, Middle Eastern affairs have been covered in American media outlets. So I wanted just to try to, beyond news, beyond demanding news stories, also to try to humanize and bring context to the subjects that I write about.
Awesome.
Okay. So what inspired you to write this particular article?
This one right here, The Lost Kingdom of Kush.
Yes. So I was contacted by Smithsonian Magazine, and they told me that they were interested in having a story about the Kingdom of Kush. This was last summer. Keep in mind the context of what was happening last summer with the protests for racial justice and so forth. And I think finally, many media outlets coming to a deeper understanding of how, this is an issue that, when we talk about race, it's about all life. When you talk about journalism, you're talking about ancient history, you're talking about politics, you're talking about government policies, how that affects, life in general. So I think that's really one of the reasons that they contacted me. But also the photographer Matt Stern had been in Sudan earlier in the year, and when he got back, this is when the pandemic came about, and there was a quarantine and lockdown. They were looking for somebody to write about this. I had written about this topic in 2013 for the New York Times. I wrote a story about the contemporary efforts then to develop archaeology in Sudan with the assistance of the Qatari government. So they contacted me, and I jumped on this. This is a passion I've had for a very long time, and that's basically how I got to writing the article. I've been interested in this topic since I was a 10-year-old child, and I was just really happy. It felt like a homecoming to me to, after, at this age, to write about a topic that really got me into history, that made me study history, that made me study journalism, to be able to tell my personal story of how within the article itself. It was just a delight.
So for many African Americans, we relate to Africa, but from a separate standpoint and a distant standpoint. And some of us, even like for me, I'm just going about me in general, but we look at that whole Nile Valley civilization as, a turning point in human history. And in the article, you mentioned, you made the statement of Nubia gave Black people a seat at the table. Can you kind of expound on that?
Sure. I mean, that particular quote. I quoted his name. I'm forgetting at the moment, Mr. That was a quote from. I'm looking for it right now. From Edmund Barry Gulther, who's the director of the Boston Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists in Boston. I mean, that was his quote, but I understand where that's coming from. Egypt for many, the background of ancient Egyptians, maybe 50 years ago, had always been this issue of debate between different, people approaching this differently. But Nubia, there was never any doubt about the origins, the skin color of Nubians, of the people who today are in southern Egypt and northern and central Sudan. So I think that's where it comes from. But really, I think today our understanding of ancient Egypt has developed and is further than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago, at least in the mainstream, so to speak. An ancient Egyptian today, by any standards, would by racial and color standards, American racial and I think it's important to make those distinctions.
Sure.
Of how mainstream the U.S. Very blunt. I mean, European, white, American archaeologists saw the ancient world. Ancient Egypt was always explained in the context of its connections to the Near East. But that African and Black element or side of Egyptian identity was always undermined, marginalized. But in the case of Nubia, ancient Sudan, there never was a question that, on the Blackness, on the skin color of ancient Nubians. So I think that's where that comes from. I mean, how we understand race, color in the ancient world, and how we understand it today, and even today, given different geographic locations, how it's how it's understood in the U.S., how it's understood in different places. I think we just need to be conscious of that. But coming back, there is no doubt that whether ancient Egyptians or ancient Nubians, by today's standard, by today's American, by racial standards in the U.S., would have been considered Black.
Yes, I think. I mean, that's what inspired me kind of to start studying it. I mean, when I got into looking at history, I mean, it was kind of, actually, it started through hip hop. and then it grew into Malcolm X's autobiography, and then just sparked this whole thing of studying and reading, and then looking at different religions. It just got into religions, and then looking at the foundation of Kush as it pertains to all the religions, and how human beings spread throughout the world. And then you see signs of Nubia, you see signs of Kush, you see signs of Kemet. Whether you're talking about here in the US, and DC obviously has monuments that are similar to that. I mean, right. I can look, you can look at the different religions, you can look at Buddhism, you can look at yoga, you can look at Hinduism, and I see those foundations into that. And so that kind of sparked me to kind of look into that. Do you refer to Egypt as Kemet, or is that something that is, I don't know, because there's always like this in terms of Black consciousness here in the US. There's always this distinction of Kemet as opposed to calling it Egypt. And I'm just curious from your standpoint, because you're from the area, or your background is from, your history is from that area specifically. So how do you refer to it?
Right. I mean, just to go back to hip hop, because I mean, you just reminded me of my first year in college and buying my first tape of Brand Nubian. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I was just attracted to the name. I hadn't heard the music. I have to buy this.
Right.
But which is one of the greatest. I mean, there's that era of hip hop in the late '80s, early '90s. I think that with the political and social consciousness, I think that deserves a greater recognition. I mean, especially with this topic. As far as Egypt, I mean, I'm of Sudanese. I don't, I'm not going to speak on behalf of Egyptians. I think that, but I do tell my Egyptian friends that I think that the Egyptian intelligentsia needs a deeper review and articulation and understanding of how they understand their history. Now, many of these places have different names over different periods for different reasons. I mean, Sudan today we call Sudan because that is the name that came about in the 19th century with Egyptian Ottoman occupation, and later with the British. But it has had different names over different periods, whether it be Kush, Ta-nehesi, ta-seti, Nubia, Sinar. These are different names that have happened, and because of political circumstances, these new names come about. And then, there are the questions: do you keep the same name, or do you change it? What are the ramifications of changing a name? Because it's not just political consciousness. There's also administrative considerations, changing your name and the cost and so forth. I mean, we know countries like, French Sudan changed their name to to Mali, the name of the Middle English Kingdom. The Gold Coast changed their name. Ghana also of an ancient, Abyssinia to Ethiopia, etc.
Sure.
With Egypt, I think the most important thing is understanding how history works. And that at the end of the day, one today is the product of many layers of historical experiences. And a better understanding, I think, for the Egyptian intelligentsia of what makes them Egyptian today, whether they choose to use the name Kemt or Misr, which is the common to the modern Arabic name, or Egyptos, Egypt, from the Greek, which is from which in itself is from the corruption of the name Kempt, so to speak. Going through different pronunciations and names and etc. I think understanding the process, which is much more important, and making that understanding reflect in policies, in social relations, in better connecting with the world, really.
What let me ask this, what is through your research, and obviously you've done a ton of research, and obviously it's personal to you because your family is of that background, so what has stood out to you the most? Has it been just the historical, I don't know, what has stood out to you the most about studying ancient Kush? Has it been religion? Has it been its gift to civilization specifically? What has stood out to you the most as you've done your research?
That's a good question. I come back to this last point that I just made about being the product of multiple layers of historical experience. I think that angle, to me, in understanding myself and my community, my family, I think that to me is significant, and that the remnants of ancient Kush civilization and culture are still there in our communities and in our family and in our nations. There are contemporary cultural practices that people don't have a clear understanding of where the roots came from and why do we do this. But when you study history, you can see or can at least speculate that there's a trail, going back to ancient times, and to me that has always been one of the. I mean, even from my clan name, my last name Kushkush. I mean, which I'm not. I don't have an absolute answer to the origins of the name, but it's possible that it is connected to Kush and the meaning of Kush. But and having that connection, I think that history, culture doesn't. It doesn't. There's no hard line ending or beginning of it. There's always a connection, and I think that's one of the problems that we, one of the issues that people generally tend to underestimate. That there's always a connection. It just builds up on different experiences.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry. Go ahead. I think you're right. Because as I think about it, we always think about hard lines in history. This period to that period, when history is just a flowing chart. It's like, it's a river. It just continues to flow. And, you can break it up to hard lines, but there's always transitional periods that occur that may seem meaningless, but that keeps the current flowing and it keeps it very smooth. And it's interesting. Your name is very interesting in the sense, your clan name is very interesting in the sense that we had a East Indian family come to the restaurant, and Kush means happy in their culture. And that one of their children, his name was Kush. And so, I don't know if I've never researched that there's a connection. I just think that there has to be a connection between, when you look at proximity in terms of Kush and the Sudan and the Indian Ocean, India, you just see that natural connection. But like you said, there's no there's no stopping point, right? It's just everything just continues to flow. And I think in researching it, now you've given me a different perspective on researching things, because you do have to talk to people. You can't just read books. You have to talk to people who are of those backgrounds, who come from those areas, maybe who've researched those things or who haven't researched those things. How do people live? And so drawing those hard lines seems to be more and more, I'm not going to say not relevant, but just, not as important as, mixing it in with culture, history, and how people actually view themselves. Because I'm looking at
absolutely. I mean, the Hindu Kush Mountains, in reference to the Indian usage of the name or word Kush. I mean, that has also been some a topic of interest. How, I mean, is it a coincidence, or is there some relationship? I mean, that is something that needs, I think, further research. And you make a good point about understanding how people in these localities understand their history, what oral histories they have of their own history, the writings of scholars in those areas, and here in the U.S. we're limited to scholarly research or articles that are written, in English by archaeologists, historians who write in languages that we understand. But do we have an understanding of how people in those localities understand themselves, and how can combining these different angles and understandings actually further our knowledge and understanding, filling in the gaps that here and there. I think that is extremely important. I mean, I'll share this with you. The elders in my village, my ancestral village, recently contacted me, especially after this article, to help write the history of the clan. I mean, as someone who grew up outside of Sudan, whether in the U.S. and the Middle East, I mean, me, that was just a great honor. And as someone whose immediate family had been 4 generations away from the village, in the capital, but the idea that a journalist or even a historian can bring relevant knowledge to the oral histories that the elders have, and see where we can combine in having a better understanding of the clan, of the city. I think that's the kind of approach to knowledge I think that we all need. I mean, just to add, I mean, in the article in the Land of Kush, or the Lost Kingdom of Kush, the Smithsonian, one of the photos is of a cemetery in Old Dungula, the town of Old Dungula, where you have the Islamic qubbas, the tombs. That is our ancestral town. I have relatives in that cemetery, whether great grandfather or so forth. So I said, when looking at it, it is very personal for me just to see this. And again, as someone who grew up outside, when I went to Sudan in 2007 and wanting to reconnect, to rediscover my roots, to reconnect with family, I went to the village not knowing anybody except having this name, Kushkush. And it was by chance that I met a professor in the capital, in Khartoum. And I told him, I'm coming from the U.S. This is, I know I belong to this clan. What information can you give me? And he started asking me questions, like, what does so and so? How are you related to so and so? That's my father's name. And he says, okay, I now understand who you are. I'm going to take you just whenever we have time. Let's go up north, and that's how I reconnected with this area.
Wow.
I mean, it's the experience of being disconnected from the roots. I mean, takes different forms of migration, with colonialism, with the slave trade.
Sure.
I think we all have different experiences, but for me, it was reconnecting to a village that my great grandfather left to work on the with the railway company during colonial times.
Mm.
And I was the first of my generation of the clan living in the capital to actually go up north and visit the town.
Wow.
This is a great conversation. I mean, sitting here, and of course, I'm sitting here listening to the YouTube talk, and questions are coming in my mind. One of the questions I want to know, of course, being a Black, African woman, Afro Latina, I'd like to understand what we represented in ancient Kush civilization. What were we powerful then? Like, what was our role back then?
So it's interesting to read again, to understand history as it was understood at its time. I mean, if you look at, say, the Greeks at the time, the Greeks looked at Kush with great respect. They saw it as one of the major civilizations of the time, as a military power, as a religious center. Kush ruled Egypt and the Levant for its time. In fact, someone like King Piankhi or King Taharqa, who was actually mentioned in the Old Testament as a protector of Jerusalem. It was seen on equal terms with the major regional powers, the global powers of the time. You find reference to Kush in the Old Testament, which I think is significant in the sense that I mean, I don't like using the word known world, but I mean, let's just for the
Like an argument.
yeah, but it was recognized as an important power. I mean, whether in the history of Christianity, you have the treasurer of the Candace being Kandaka being a title of the queens of Meroe of ancient Kush, who converted to Christianity, who went to Jerusalem. The story of Kushites as a part of this global system at the time, I think is relevant, is important. It was recognized. I think that's where how we understand history again is I want to come back to that, is that how many European and American views on archaeology of ancient history had always been shaped by trying to prove biblical stories, or trying to or marginalizing the contributions of Africans, of Black people, because they came to this with their own racial understandings of the time, especially the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And I think modern archaeology, modern historians, I think, are much more conscious and aware of how that all needs to be revised.
Okay. And my question to you, Greg, is, so this name Kush and the vegan restaurant, what was your idea or plan? What were you trying to do with all of this by naming the restaurant the Land of Kush?
I mean, for me, it was to get from an African American perspective, a lot of times we only look at our history from slavery, from the transatlantic slave trade to current times. And what I was studying was really ancient. And I think a lot of African Americans don't know about our connection and contributions. And I think you made a very valid point on how people view race. So from a United States standpoint on how we view race may be a little bit different than globally in other parts of the world. But the way we view it is, we look at ourselves as being Black, and there's a tremendous amount of Black history that is from a global standpoint that far predates the transatlantic slave trade. And I just wanted to bring awareness to that by calling it the Land of Kush, because everything I was studying kept leading back to Kush. Ancient Nile Valley civilization, it kept leading back to there. And even when I study when I was studying Chinese, when I was studying traditional Chinese medicine in the I Ching, and it was just everything kept ringing back to ancient Kush. And so, when I was studying religions, I was looking at different religions, and it kept pointing to around that area. So I wanted to bring awareness, and it was all just to make people ask, why did you name it the Land of Kush? Oh, well, because there's this global Black history, that there's this global Black diaspora from a historical standpoint that much of us do not know about. And, we need to have conversations about, especially when I go and talk to schools and talk to the youth, just to give them some other perspectives on researching history. And like you said, history has been documented a certain way. And those ideas have changed in the mainstream. But I think it needs to be put out there more, especially when you look at TV. I mean, obviously, when you go back and watch the 10 Commandments, it doesn't look historically correct necessarily in terms of, the skin tones and racial features of people who may have been around that time. And so, we need to have those conversations and need to image those perspectives. I see it a lot in cartoons. I see it a lot because I'm heavy into animation and cartoons, and you still see those negative images about that area, about Kush. They speak in terms of Egypt, but you see that negative imagery, which needs to kind of change, and those perspectives need to change so that not only Black people need to understand what the history is, but everybody needs to understand what the history is, so that we can begin to look at ourselves differently. So it's just to bring up a point of conversation, to have that conversation, and to learn more about global history. And I think when you do that, you begin to understand other people's cultures, and I think it helps build relationships. So that's kind of where it came from for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I was looking at one of the pictures and I saw the little boy, if anybody noticed that, the little boy waiting for hibiscus tea. And I think about the sorrow we make, so yeah, I just needed Greg to express that. But yeah.
And it wasn't even from a perspective of food, but now I have to look at it and be like, okay, well, what foods do people eat over there? What grains are, millet. I love millet. I'm big on millet. Not in the restaurant, but at home. But I'm big on millet. I'm big on ancient grains and things like that. So, what recommendations can you make for people wanting to study more about ancient Kush or ancient African history in general?
Right. So, I feel that I have to mention the one documentary that really got me into this. I mean, it's not the only one, but the British historian Basil Davidson, who for his at his time in the 60s and 70s, and His writings on African history at the time were considered quite radical because they were a departure from how many white journalists, white historians viewed Africa. His documentary Africa, and particularly the first episode, which was titled "Different but Equal," was the very first time that I saw ancient Kush, pyramids of ancient Meroe, on TV. This is 1984 or 85. And so that documentary, I think, is worth watching, that first episode, and you can definitely find it on YouTube and see his books, Basil Davidson. But there are a number of books. I think there are a number of historians that have now discussed Kush in further details, and there are also scientific papers that you can refer to. One book that I do like, let me see it, which is very hard to find, but I think is one of the best books on ancient Kush and Nubia. Let me just show this.
No problem. While you're looking for that, I just want to let people know they're tuning into Naijha Speaks, and we are talking about the lost kingdom of Kush. We're here with Isma'il Kushkush. He is a journalist, and he did a piece, "The Lost in the Land of Kush," for Smithsonian Magazine in September 2020. So this is the nice spread. He talked about a dazzling civilization flourished in Sudan more than 2,000 years ago, and why was it forgotten? So, you know, if you haven't seen that, you need to order that copy because it's amazing. So anyone having a question about what is Kush, it's an ancient African civilization, very powerful civilization. You want to learn more about that.
Yeah. This book by William Adams, Nubia, which is hard to find, but is probably one of the most extensive books on ancient Nubia, Nubia Corridor to Africa by William Adams. I first came across this book as a freshman in college. I went to Sacramento City College, and I remember seeing that book, you know, walking into the library and having, and I've always wanted to, you know, get this book. It's out of print, but it's probably one of the best books on the topic. But there are a number of other books. Henry Louis Gates and Professor Charles Bonnet also have a book on the ancient civilization, on Kerma, the very first capital of ancient Kush. I think the name escapes me at the moment, but I do know that it is also, I mean, in discussing Kush, I mean, we often focus on either Nepeta, the capital, in Kush in its second phase, from its capital at Nepeta, or the third phase from its capital at Meroe, where the pyramids are. But I think Kerma is also very interesting because it's really the very beginning of ancient Kush, of ancient Nubia, who were rivals to the first dynasty in Egypt. So understanding that, I think is important. In addition to the article in the Smithsonian, I think a good article to read is came out at the same time in the magazine Archaeology by Matt, who was a photographer for the Smithsonian piece. But it's the rise of the Nubian kingdoms, and this is it has a lot on Kerma, the first capital of Kush. So it gives you a deeper understanding of how this started. But there are a number of works, I think, that if you look on, I mean, and it's not just the books, but also I would look at papers in archaeology and in history that are worth looking into.
Yes, sir.
This was great. Any last questions you want to close out with?
I'll let you close out because I'll probably talk to him all day. But.
Yeah, I mean, but we have the connection, so he can reach out to you. You got the email, and that would be the next question. How can people best connect with you, Isma'il? I put your website up. Let's see what we got here. I just put something in there. Not that one. Sorry. It's sites.google.com, but you also have a Twitter, right?
Yes.
How can they best connect with you, on the site or through the Twitter?
Either way. So I'm on Twitter at Is Kush, very easy to remember. I'm also on Facebook, Isma'il Kushkush, and I do have a website. But let me just one last thought. In 2019, the people of Sudan had a popular revolution, an uprising against authoritarian rule. One of the leading chants of the revolution was "Ana Gidita Haka, Ana Habobti Kandaka." My grandfather is Taharka. My grandmother was a Kandaka. Taharka being one of the kings of the Kush, Kandaka being the queens of ancient Kush. Even today, the youth of Sudan are looking back into their ancient history as a source of aspiration to better their future against the authoritarian rule, and I think that in itself is telling how history is significant to forward hopes for a better life.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for taking the time out to celebrate with us 10-year anniversary. It couldn't have been a much better time to have an article come out so we can definitely educate ourselves more about the lost kingdom of Kush, and then share this interview, the broadcast, with all of our followers. So this has been great. I definitely appreciate you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And again, if you have questions for Isma'il Kushkush, everything is in the comments, and you can always visit the Land of Kush at landofkush.com. We're on Baltimore, Maryland, 840 North Utah Street. Thank you. Stay well and be safe.
Thank you.